teeth bared as the sword slashed across his torso. The boy stood looking in front of him, where a giant eagle was already flying towards him, preparing to grab him with clawed paws. The next moment he swung his sword, cutting off one of the huge wings, causing the attacker to scream loudly. Looking around, the warrior looked around, standing in the middle of the bodies of defeated monsters, among which could be seen a griffin, a wolf, and several goblins. One of them, lying on the ground with a broken horn, looked up at the boy, thinking that he had single-handedly defeated so many enemies. Looking at the calm brunette, the creature thought that there was only one person in the world who could do this, namely Raven Valte, who was called the Immortal Warrior. He was known everywhere as the Demon Storm. He brought the sword and in a moment brought it down on the neck of the opponent, who managed to survive the previous fight, which caused his eyes to widen in fear. Finishing his work, Raven raised his head to the sky as he looked up at the night sky, thinking that the time was almost here. Staring into the night sky, he thought that in 15 days he would be able to get the freedom he dreamed of, if he survived, and would be able not to appear here again. At dawn, standing on a hill, the boy looked down at the camp of demon slayers spread out below. The soldiers present there were drinking, singing loudly, and waving bottles. Seeing the captives chained to the huge crates and sitting with their heads down, Raven remembered the hell in which he had to live for 10 years. He knew full well that demon slayers were cannon fodder, sent to war with demons, considering it the worst punishment possible. Most often, slaves and robbers were sent here, that is, those who wanted to sneeze on themselves, their lives, or anyone in general. Watching his trail as he walked through the camp, the warriors whispered that he had once again killed his companions during the raid. However, even then, it was recognized that for a former aristocrat, he was well versed in the art of combat. Raven heard someone calling him and stopped. Seeing a huge carcass in front of him, the boy indifferently looked up at the thug. Zdrovan smiled widely, putting his hands to his sides. Gold earrings flashed in his ears, and 2 henchmen stood behind him. With a knock, Raven replied that he was clearly tired of living, and a slight smile bloomed on his scarred face. Hearing his words, the knight clenched his teeth tightly, restraining his rage. However, a moment later he was bent in half by a powerful blow that Raven rewarded him with. In the next second, the boy took out his sword and put it to the throat of the frightened henchman of the big man, who rushed to help. A small cut appeared on the neck from the sharp blade, from which blood flowed. The third attacker looked at the brunette with a frightened look, not daring to attack. When he placed a black-gloved hand on his face, the man only let out a short cry. Immediately after that, Raven slammed his head into the ground with all his might, which was accompanied by a thump. The chief eunuch, standing on his knees and not raising his head, roared menacingly, swearing at the boy standing in front of him. In the next moment, his eyes widened as he saw a sword blade just millimeters from his face. Looking at the thug, Raven replied that if he wanted to end everything before the demons got to him, he could turn to him. After these words, the boy continued on his way, completely ignoring the threats of the big man who was holding on to the wounded arm. As he made his way down the path to his tent, he thought about the fact that he didn't really care what was being said about him behind his back, because the rumors were generally true. The Walta family was one of the noble families of the empire, despite not having much fame or influence. However, once they lost everything, at the memory of this, a shadow of grief fell over Raven's face again. The boy remembered how 10 years ago he stood in shackles, and guards stood behind him. In front of him stood the ancestral nest of the Valte family, engulfed in flames, from which sparks flew into the sky, full of red glow. In front of the estate stood a man who, with his arms outstretched to the sides, joyfully shouted that the Valte family had been executed for preparing a rebellion. Hearing this, Raven let out a loud cry, trying to clear his family's name. The guards barely restrained the boy, who rushed to prove that they were useless here. The man responded with a condescending smile on his face, saying that the son of traitors could deny his guilt as much as he wanted. Bouncing out of his skin, Raven screamed desperately that the rebellion was planned by the other families, and the Vault family had simply been lied to. The boy stayed on his feet thanks to the guards who held him from behind, and the man came up to him, and grabbing his forelock, lifted his head, forcing him to look at himself. He asked with a smile if he wanted to join his parents who had already burned to the ground, adding that he would be lenient and give him a chance. Tears of impotent rage and helplessness streamed down Raven's cheeks as he realized what this chance would mean. Approaching his face, The man said that he was appointing him as a demon slayer for 10 years, adding that this was his only chance for mercy. Hearing the sentence, Raven let out a weak growl, realizing what was in store for him. Looking at this picture, the aristocrats who had gathered in a crowd around the Valte family menorah gasped when they heard what punishment was prepared for the young heir. Many thoughts were spinning in his head. Realizing that with his death, the Valte family would come to an end, Raven swallowed hard. Looking at the executioner with an indifferent look, the boy specified whether he would be free after serving 10 years and provided he survived. Waving his hand, the man assured him that of course he would get his freedom after 10 years of service. Of course, if he manages to survive. With tears in his eyes, Raven spat out that he was willing to serve, and then he would return to restore the glory of the Valte family. Falling to his knees in front of the burning estate, the boy swore that this was how everything would be. As he approached his tent, Raven thought his days of shameful punishment were over. He closed his eyes tightly and took a deep breath. Remembering his first battle, the boy thought that he had been fighting here since the very first day until now, without even having any fighting skills. And at the same time, he still managed to survive, despite everything. In these 10 years, Raven has turned from a boy into a demon slayer. Throwing off the hood and entering the tent, the boy thought about the fact that there was only one big campaign against the monsters left before the desired freedom. It is after this case that he will be able to set out on the road to restore the honor of the Valte family. Meanwhile, in the forest of Ancum, in the lands of Lord Pendragon, a fair-haired boy stood before a large white dragon in gilded armor. The dragon looks at the frightened boy, reminding the knight that it is time for him to fulfill the vow he made. Dragons were fire-breathing creatures that surpassed any demon in strength, so there were no equals. And only the Pendragon family knew how to call dragons to help and tame them. In the Empire, this family was considered one of the most powerful. 13 days before Raven was supposed to be amnestied, he went to the Demon Slayer Regiment commander's tent to report to him. Biting into the smoked calf and wrapping his arm around the waist of one of the unfortunate slaves, the bald, bearded man growled, displeased that he had returned alone, demanding an account. In the eyes of Raven himself, indifference was mixed with quiet hatred and rage. The boy reported that the horde of demons outnumbered them, so if they managed to break through to the front flank, their squad would have a hard time. Hearing this, the commander smiled wryly, surprised that his subordinate would admit that he would not have coped with them himself. Raven didn't react to that, but he continued that if it weren't for one circumstance, they would have gotten used to the ground long ago. With a smile on his face, the bearded man added that Duke Pendragon himself was supposed to come to their aid tomorrow. The Demon Slayer's expression continued to remain indifferent, even as the commander announced the mighty dragon that would be arriving with a guest. However, he was surprised that such a powerful creature would help them, so the boy squinted in disbelief. The commander waved his hand casually, replying that of course it was hard to believe, but the Pendragons had been taming dragons since ancient times, so he would deal with the demons. Raven thought, remembering that the Pendragons were related to the Emperor himself. And even though they had a white dragon on their coat of arms, he considered the stories about taming dragons to be just legends. Putting a hand to his chin, the brunette thought that in 10 years of war with demons, he had never seen a dragon, which made him think that Baltai was just crazy. Additionally, the direct descendants of the earliest Pendragons were rumored to have died out, leading to their recent decline in influence. Resting his hand on his side, Raven did answer the commander that all this sounds very implausible. However, he only pointed a finger at him, adding that orders are not discussed, so he is allowed not to go into battle tomorrow. Hearing this, the Demon Slayer stared at the outstretched finger, questioning how this was possible. Baltai replied that the dragon would do all the work for them, so they could relax, but Raven himself would guard the Duke's son. The boy agreed to this offer without thinking for a long time. The commander of the regiment laughed loudly, glad that his subordinate thought with his head. Maintaining an indifferent look, Raven replied that he understood the commander's order. Baltai, leaning on the legs of one of the slaves, growled, sending him to meet the Duke, after which he ordered to draw the brew, continuing the revelry. In a while, the brunette was standing in front of a tent, above the entrance of which hung a large image of a white dragon on a red background. The same was true of the flags flying nearby. Looking at this, the boy couldn't understand how such a noble person had come here to help the demon slayers. He understood that since the commander called him the Duke's son, Barchuk would be pampered under his guard. Scratching the back of his head, Raven let out a breath, thinking that the most important thing for him right now was to survive, and then he could be free. Entering the tent, he called the host, apologizing for disturbing him. The boy's eyes widened in fright at the voice that sounded from the depths. The voice he heard was quite inhuman. Exhaling, the demon slayer dropped to one knee and questioned if he was indeed speaking to Lord Pendragon. The voice replied that he was indeed a lord, so he advised the guest to introduce himself and tell why he had come. Without raising his head, Raven introduced himself, adding that he was the commander of the 12th Demon Slayer platoon, who had been ordered to protect the Lord in tomorrow's battle. However, the voice replied that he would not need help tomorrow, so the boy could go and rest. Raven listened to the order in silence, but was in no hurry to go anywhere. Noticing this, the voice asked if he needed anything else. Raising his head, the Demon Slayer did dare to ask if he really brought a dragon with him, because without it, they would lose the battle. However, the voice assured him that the dragon would fight on their side, then asked him to leave him alone for now. Raven bowed before meekly turning around and walking towards the exit of the tent. However, at the very exit he stopped, turned his head in the direction from where the voice was heard, thinking that it clearly did not belong to the child. However, the thought immediately arose in his head that it was none of his business, because he would carry out the order and he would not have to see the Duke again. The next sunny day, the entire army gathered in front of Pendragon's tent. Baltai, looking at the banner, announced that before them was the young Duke Pendragon himself. Everyone looked in front of them with interest, when a big cloud of dust appeared around them. Taking cover from the dust and debris, Raven cursed mentally, not understanding what was happening. In the next moment, a large blue eye with a vertical pupil was staring at them from the cloud. Seeing this, the boy looked at the creature, not believing his eyes. A large white dragon with golden horns flew into the sky from the tent, raising clouds of dust with huge wings. The picture was so fascinating that the boy did not even look away from it. The dragon looked at the squad of warriors standing before him with a gaze full of wisdom. This picture even made Raven's mouth drop open. The creature turned its gaze to the knight standing next to it. He was dressed in white armor, and behind the back of the major was a red cloak. The demon slayer also stared unblinkingly at the young duke. He raised his visor, revealing his face, and called his name, urging everyone to exterminate the demons. Already at the site of the military campaign, in Lobton Prairie, Raven tried to cover the Duke himself, saying that he had never been entrusted with the protection of a respectable person. Pendragon himself was standing behind him, watching the demon slayer. Drawing his sword, Raven thought that even if the dragon attacked enemies from the air, he could deal with them on the ground. Raising his weapon, the brunette prepared to fight the monsters. Wolves standing opposite, frightened, roared at the fighter. In the next moment, the warriors' swords were stained with their blood. Having finished with the wolves, the boy looked up to see a dragon's tail in the sky. The creature descended, opening its mouth from which a blue light flew out. He exhaled, and the blue flame engulfed both the carcasses of the dead monsters and the still living griffons. Those with loud screams flew down, trying to flap their burnt wings. However, the dragon did not stop, continuing to release tongues of blue flame. Slinging his sword over his shoulder, Raven admired the power the creature exuded, turning his head towards the Duke. The demon slayer added that he thought the power of dragons was just a fairy tale, but today he was convinced that everything was the pure truth. Looking at the white dragon, which floated in tongues of flame, the boy thought with satisfaction that he had managed to destroy more than half of the demonic army. It was thanks to the dragon that the battle was almost won, so in the grand scheme of things, they didn't even have anything to do. The dragon landed behind Pendragon, causing the knight to look up at him. Raven approached the Duke, asking if he and his dragon were all right. Dusting off his robes, the brunette added that the battle was almost won, and in their favor. However, at that moment, a pack of griffins began circling above them again, emitting loud cries. The trio immediately raised their heads to the sky, watching the monsters. Seeing them, Raven let out a tired breath, realizing that a new round was about to begin. Turning his head to the Duke, the brunette asked him to give the order to the white dragon. Having obeyed, he immediately turned to face his companion. In the next moment, the dragon closed his eyes sadly. Duke Pendragon did exactly the same. Meanwhile, the Gryphons were already attacking, putting their clawed paws forward. Raven stared unblinkingly at the monsters, thinking that there were quite a few of them, so there was only hope for a dragon. He raised his head and spread his wings, preparing for a collision. After that, he closed his eyes, placing his mouth under the light. In the next second, his whole body was surrounded by griffins, which began to bite him and claw at his skin. Raven didn't understand what was happening, so he watched in shock. From the nails and beaks of the griffins, deep scratches began to appear on the skin of the dragon, from which blood flowed. Seeing this picture, Raven screamed desperately, demanding the dragon to fight them. However, Duke Pendragon himself stood calmly watching everything that was happening. The demon slayer grabbed the knight by the scruff of the neck, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. While he was shaking it, a great cloud of dust rose up beside them. Hearing the noise, the brunette turned his stunned gaze in the direction from where it was coming from. A horde of monsters rushed at them again, flashing their hungry eyes. Covering the young duke with his body, Raven thought that despite those they had defeated, there were too many underdogs. In the next second, Pendragon was already fending off a huge griffin that came at him from behind. At this time, Raven took on a giant wolf, which rushed at him with a gaping mouth. He remembered again that the dragon was considered the strongest creature on Earth. After that, the memory of how the brunette himself considered their battle almost won came to mind. After that, he remembered ordering the dragon to act against the griffins that were flying at them, since the whole campaign depended on the dragon. And now he was trying to catch his breath, chastising himself for relying on the dragon and underestimating his opponent. The demon slayer was kneeling in the middle of the carnage, staring at the white dragon, its wings pierced by 2 stakes. Tears were rolling down the brunette's face in a hailstorm, mixing with blood. Watching them fall to the ground in drops, the boy chastised himself for what he had done. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, monsters were tearing up the bodies of his dead comrades. Goblins, bayonets and knives in their hands, went to collect valuables while giggling hideously. They jumped up, about to attack the demon slayer. However, seeing how he stood up, right in flight, they rushed at him in fright. With one swing of his sword, Raven killed 3 attackers at once. Finally, the boy bent over tiredly, leaning on his sword. He perfectly understood that he was too tired, and if he fell now with a deep wound, he would not be able to get up. Lifting his face up, Raven let out a loud moan. He stared at the defeated white dragon, thinking about what fools they both were. The boy took a step, and the toe of his shoe sank into a pool of thick blood. Looking at the animal's deep wounds, the brunette wondered if it was really dead. Knight Pendragon lay beside the belly of the white dragon. Suddenly, the young duke coughed, spitting out some blood. Raven looked at the ward, surprised that he had survived. Pendragon looked at the brunette, turning his head slightly. In the next second, loud moans were heard from him. Looking at him with an indifferent look, Raven asked if he really survived. He approached the duke and, grabbing him by the scruff of the neck, forced him to look into his eyes. In a cold tone, the boy asked him why the dragon stopped fighting, but in an instant he understood that it happened because of the master. Remembering how the two had talked, Raven muttered that the blonde simply gave the dragon an order that was not what he was asked to do. He just remained silent, not reacting to the demon slayer's accusations. Watching him, the brunette clenched his teeth tightly in impotent rage. Without stopping, in a moment Raven was already growling in the duke's face that if it wasn't for him, everyone could have survived. So now he was wondering why he did all this. In the next second, the boy fell silent, feeling a blow to his back. Opening his eyes, he rasped, barely audible from the sharp pain. Unable to say anything, the demon slayer slammed into the ground with a thud. Baltai towered over him, amazed that he remained alive even after his heart was pierced. All Raven could do was hiss the platoon leader's name with hatred in his voice. However, he did not pay attention to this. Instead, he swung again, planning to finish what he had started. The man raised his axe, giving the command to the army to attack, after which the soldiers rushed forward. The flags that flew above them displayed a coat of arms with a lion on a red background, with black wings and a crown behind. Looking at this, Raven wondered why the Imperial Army obeyed Baltai. However, he only smiled wryly, seeing the surprise on the subordinate's face, and advised him not to be surprised. And while the fat man was rejoicing that everything went according to plan, his axe was already touching young Pendragon's neck. At the same time, the man growled that some still did not want to give up. The Duke looked tiredly at the big man, not having the strength to fight him. In the next moment, Raven saw the blonde's head fly away from his body. Realizing that it was all over, the monster slayer fell to his knees. His puzzled gaze continued to be fixed on the Duke's head. Watching his subordinate, Baltai giggled that the boy should have died a long time ago, just like himself. In the next moment, Raven felt himself being crushed by a heavy army boot. Again snoring blood, the brunette thought about the fact that such a dream freedom was already quite close. Baltai approached him, grabbed his forelock, and forced him to look at himself. The fat man spat in his subordinate's face that his abilities were simply supernatural. At these words, Raven's eyes widened in fright as he realized that the commander knew everything. Baltai continued, asking whether he would survive if his head was cut open, adding that he had been pretending not to know about this weakness since the first day. With a nasty smile on his face, the fat man added words of sympathy at the expense of the fact that he would die without ever gaining freedom. Raven gritted her teeth as she thought about freedom and restoring her clan's good name. I remembered the day when the guard burned down the ancestral estate of the Volta family, and now, holding his chest, the boy thought that the weak die in a year or two, and he himself managed to practically reach the end of the term. He raised his head as the platoon leader's sword touched his chin. Baltai smiled, saying that the accusations against his family, his exile, and his death with Pendragon were actually planned. The man grabbed his forehead, looking into his eyes, which were wide open. Raven couldn't believe what he was hearing, so he gave the commander a shocked look. He poked him in the ribs with his boot, adding that the only thing that hadn't been planned was that the dragon would be so weak. Carrying his axe, the fat man remarked that in the end, everything turned out as planned, while saying goodbye to his subordinate. Raven looked at the squad leader with hatred in her eyes, unable to stand up and fight back. At the moment when Raven's head separated from the body, the dragon barely perceptibly stirred. Barely finding strength, the creature flashed blue eyes. Grabbing a stake sticking out of its wing, the dragon pulled it out with one yank. He looked sadly at the bodies of his recent allies. Blood began to rise from the bodies of all those who had fallen on the battlefield. Suddenly a whirlwind arose and the creature spread its membranous wings. A black portal hole opened in the sky above his head. With a wave of them, the dragon flew up, heading straight for her. Today, he could obtain the blood of thousands of warriors, thousands of demons, and the blood of an imperial descendant and royal dragon. The final component of fulfilling his vow was a solar eclipse. 0. At that moment, the horn on the dragon's head lit up with a bright blue light. The animal stood on its hind legs, trying to support its large body with its tail. Raising his head to the full moon, he looked at the stars falling, leaving white tails behind them. The last thing on the dragon's mind was that the fate of the entire world was now in the hands of the dragon rider. Raven opened his eyes with great effort, trying to understand if he had died. However, he quickly realized that such feelings were only when the wounds were healing. Realizing that he was still alive, the boy opened his mouth, blowing air bubbles. Opening his eyes, the boy saw the maid who was tending to him, but he could not understand where he was. At some point, the boy felt someone touch his wrist. Raven raised his upper body on the bed, scaring the maid to death. In a moment, she let out a loud cry, looking at him with wide-open eyes. Immediately after that, she rushed out of the room, shouting to everyone that he had woken up. Sitting on the bed, the boy tried to understand what was happening and why he was called Milord. Looking around, Raven saw a lavishly furnished room, which made him even more confused as to where he was. Behind the door came the sound of footsteps approaching his room. A moment later, the door opened wide, and an elderly man in a tailcoat flew in, asking from the threshold if the young gentleman had really come to his senses. At the door of the room, Raven saw, in addition to the old maid, who was next to him when he woke up, as well as another woman in a luxurious dress. The man muttered with tears in his eyes that the young man had really come to his senses. He carefully leaned over the boy's bed, asking how he was and if he remembered him. Raven awkwardly asked if they were calling him young master. This greatly surprised the old man, causing him to exclaim in surprise that they were now in Castle Conrad, which was the home of the Pendragon family. The man also added that the boy is its owner, Ellen Pendragon. Hearing the young duke's name, Raven stared in front of him in a daze. Immediately after that, he rushed to the bowl of water, not believing what he heard. The same blonde boy he was supposed to protect during the demon raid was staring at him from there. The boy turned to the maid who came up to him, anxiously asking if he had forgotten what he looked like. A man in a tailcoat approached her, holding her by the shoulder and reminding her that the young man had been unconscious for 3 years. Raven raised his head at these words, looking away from the bowl of water, wondering at such a long period. The memory of how he was beheaded along with Pendragon flashed into his mind, and he remembered this quite clearly. The boy could not understand why he became Pendragon instead of Death, even though he was almost immortal. Suddenly, the door of the room opened wide, letting in bright daylight, and an alarmed, fair-haired woman flew into the room, holding the hem of her dress. She looked at the boy with wide green eyes, surprised that her son had regained consciousness. And while everyone present turned to face her, greeting their mistress, Raven sat on the bed, trying to understand who she was. Seeing her rushing towards him, the boy opened his eyes in fright. Looking at his guest, he tried to understand who she was. Seeing the young duke pointing at her, the elderly woman who had come with the doctor squinted one eye, wagging her finger in denial. Meanwhile, the blonde woman hugged Raven, asking him if he remembered her, his mother, but he only thought that he didn't remember anything. Slightly moving away from the mother, the boy turned his gaze to the elderly woman who was waving her hand. At one point, she pointed her finger somewhere in the direction of the window, and he meekly turned his head in that direction. His eyes widened in shock at what he saw. A white dragon sat on one of the towers, clinging to the roof cone. Feeling a close look on him, he turned his eyes to Pendragon. The boy calmly looked at the dragon, quietly breathing out his name. Immediately after that, Soldrake opened his mouth and let out a loud growl. Everyone present in the room froze, scared to death by the loud roar and debris flying in their direction. The dragon approached, his huge claws clawing at the floor of the room. Raven sat with her face covered and trying to figure out how she knew the dragon's name. However, what surprised him the most was that he perfectly remembered that the dragon died on the same day that he and Ellen died. The boy even had the option that the dragon did not die at all, but he still did not understand what was happening around him. Suddenly, the figure of Ellen's mother appeared in front of him, shouting to Soldrake that she would no longer allow him to attack her son. The dragon looked at her with a careful gaze of bright blue eyes, the vertical pupils of which were yellow-green. Milady Helena stood with her arms spread wide, her eyes tightly closed in fear. In a moment, an elderly woman appeared in front of her, holding out her hand to the dragon with a gentle smile. He meekly stopped growling, bowing his head to her. Not knowing what to expect next, Raven lunged forward, holding out her arms, causing Lady Helena to look around in surprise. The elderly woman, stroking the dragon's mouth, turned to the boy with a sweet, light smile. Seeing her wink at him, Raven recoiled in fright. Milady Helena immediately jumped up to him, demanding that he sit down because it was dangerous. The boy shifted his gaze to the elderly woman, wondering if only he could see her. An elderly woman stroked the dragon's face, and he calmly accepted her caress. In a moment, the dragon flapped its wide wings and took off, leaving the room. The elderly woman watched silently as the majestic animal flew away. Immediately after that, she turned her face to the boy, and looking at him intently, dissolved in the air. Raven stared in silence at the picture unfolding before his eyes. The man flew up to Milady Helen, holding her hand and asking if she was all right. She replied to Melbourne that everything was fine, but she was more interested in her son's well-being. The boy plunged into his thoughts, trying to analyze everything he saw around, namely the servants who were worried about him, the castle, and the name of the dragon. Lady Helen looked anxiously at her son, calling his name. Realizing that he had been silent for too long, Raven smiled broadly and replied that he was fine. Hearing this, the fair-haired woman breathed a sigh of relief, and a slight smile warmed on Melbourne's face. Watching them, the boy thought that it was necessary to behave naturally while he dealt with what had happened. In addition, it was necessary to make sure that no one mistook him for an imposter. Only in this way will he be able to find out what happened. So far, what he remembered was that he was able to serve 10 years, exiled to a place where the weak did not survive. All these years he trained his martial arts and generation ability, becoming a warrior like no other. During the last campaign, after which he was supposed to be released, he was assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. However, he himself managed to be reborn in the body of a fair-haired lord 7 years before the deadly battle. Now, instead of dirt and stench, he had a maid who persistently fed him from a spoon like a small child. Raven was sitting in bed, covered with a blanket, and across from him was Lindsay, who was handing him a spoonful of rice. And no matter how he tried to convince her that he could eat by himself, since he had recovered a few days ago, she repeated that he needed rest and bed rest. Looking at the girl as she brought the spoon to his mouth again, Raven thought that she had been Ellen's personal maid before he fell into a coma. The boy gritted his teeth, thinking that she was like a hen clucking around her egg. But realizing that he was Ellen now and had little choice but to arouse suspicion, he resigned himself and closed his eyes and opened his mouth. When breakfast was finished, Lindsay got out of bed, offering to help the boy change his clothes. However, he, taking off his shirt, replied that he did not need help. Instead, he asked the scared-to-death maid to bring him a hairband, wondering how long Ellen's braids were. But she froze, opening her mouth wide, and her face was covered with large drops of sweat. Lindsay rushed to meet him, grabbing the dazed gentleman by the elbow. Looking at him with big eyes, she rehearsed to his face that he could not get up because his body was not yet strong. Lindsay tugged at his hand, assuring him that she would get him clothes and do his hair herself. Looking at him again with tearful eyes, she asked him not to go anywhere. The maid sat him on a stool, starting to do his hair. Raven exhaled at this time, assuring her that he was not going anywhere, but he really wanted to be alone. When everything was done, the boy thought that he no longer liked this life, because everyone around him was running and doing everything for him. Covering his face with his hand, Raven thought that he would soon go insane from everything that was happening around him. However, Lindsay was again fussing over him, worried about whether the young gentleman liked his hairdo, to which he assured her that everything was fine. Looking at the boy twirling in front of the mirror, the girl wondered what else she could do to help him. However, just as Raven tried to reassure her that he didn't need anything, he heard the door open, followed by someone's energetic voice. A young fair-haired girl with big blue eyes was standing at the door of the room, asking her brother how he was doing. A little girl was standing next to her, holding a plush bunny in her hands. Lindsay, calling them Milady Mia and Eileen, made Raven a little cross as he realized that he was not going to be able to be alone. Seeing how the little one rushed to her brother, Eileen held out her hand to stop her. Raven looked down at the cute little girl clinging to his leg, but she looked at him attentively with big blue eyes. Not knowing what to say to that, the boy just smiled widely. His sister came up to him, apologizing for the little one, at the same time being surprised that he had already started walking. Eileen gracefully sat down in the chair Lindsay had pulled out for her, thanking her gallantly. Looking hopefully at her brother, the girl asked if they sometimes bothered him. At this, Raven assured his sister with a smile that nothing terrible had happened. Hearing this, Eileen clapped her hands, glad that he had come to his senses. Besides, she offered her brother a walk in the garden as soon as he got a little stronger. Hearing the girl talking again about the garden and the cornflowers he had planted before the coma, the boy could barely restrain himself from rolling his eyes. He thought about the fact that it was worth saying once about the loss of memory, how his sister began to talk about his life for hours, although he needed it. Raven learned that instead of training, Ellen liked to draw pictures, read, and take care of flowers, and absolutely not interested in battles. And thanks to the fact that the boy cowardly hid in his room, a rumor quickly spread among the nobility that he did not even know how to hold a sword in his hands. It was because of Helenus, who became a laughing stock, that the Pendragon family lost its status. Looking at his hand, Raven thought that he was now in Ellen's place, and besides, he had gone back in time, so now the Duke was about 17 years old. The boy had heard that Ellen fell into oblivion when he was, so it remained a mystery how he managed to inhabit him if he was so unconscious. However, I realized that it is not important, because now he could fix everything, since he survived and went back in time. Previously, he was sent to the camp of demon slayers, and now he had a chance to achieve what he had not been able to do before. Squinting, Raven began to remember what he had not been able to achieve, and Baltai's words came to mind. He had said before his death that his family's accusations, exile, and death had been planned, and now it was up to Raven to find out what really happened. Now, being both Ellen Pendragon and Raven Valthy at the same time, he could start the fight from the beginning. The boy was brought out of his thoughts by the voice of Lady Eileen, who touched his hand and asked if he could hear her. After receiving permission to continue, the sister continued that Lady Luna was on her way to see him soon. However, Raven's only reaction to this information was to ask who Lady Luna was. Covering her mouth with her hand, Eileen let out a disappointed breath, realizing that her brother had never mentioned Luna, so she explained that she was Count Seyrod's stepdaughter. And the Seyrod family, to which the girl belonged, made up a significant part of the Pendragon cavalry. Folding her hands dreamily and placing them under her cheek, Lady Eileen added that Lady Luna was his bride. Hearing this, all Raven could do was yawn briefly, looking at her sister with wide eyes. At that time, a carriage accompanied by a troop of warriors was approaching the castle on the road, whose banners depicted a red wolf in a crown standing on its hind legs. The leader of the squad braked his horse at the carriage window, with a smile informing his lady that very soon she would be done with the ridiculous contract. A young girl with ashen hair looked at him from the carriage with a cold, indifferent look. Sir Breeden glared at her, asking her what she thought about meeting her future husband. However, Lady Luna coldly reminded him of his place and the duties he should attend to. After that, the girl let out a tired breath and leaned back, lost in thought. She remembered the first time she had seen Ellen Pendragon, hiding behind the curtain, sitting on the floor by the easel. He didn't even dare to come around the corner when they met in the corridor. That is why he gave the impression of a weakling and a coward. Engagement with him was beneficial to her family. However, now the father allowed them to break up. Everyone knew that the fame of House Pendragon had declined significantly in the past 3 years, and marrying a representative of a dishonored family did not make any sense. However, it was not only a matter of status. Lady Luna was happy with her father's decision to break off the engagement, as she herself did not want Ellen. She was brought out of her thoughts by Joseph's voice, who was talking about Duke Pendragon again, wondering if he had managed to change. At this, Lady Luna gave him another cold look, replying that she would speak, and advised him not to enter into conflicts with their knights. At this, the man snorted, saying that there might not be any knights left, since nothing would bring back the glory of the Pendragon family. And it was all due to the fact that everyone knew perfectly well that Ellen still had not managed to tame the dragon, and this meant that the end of their family was near, because the strength of their house was precisely in dragons. Pointing his finger at himself, Sir Breeden held his head up proudly, declaring that he would be the better party. It was his prowess that could bring great glory to House Seyrod, and no Pendragon could match him. However, he was interrupted by the stern voice of Lady Luna, who replied that she disgusted him and he should disappear from her sight. Hearing such words, the knight politely bowed, apologizing for his rudeness. However, she only closed her eyes, wondering if there would be a worthy man among the Seyrods and Pendragons. One of the applicants was a weakling, the other a braggart, and she didn't need both. In a while, he and Sir Breeden were standing in the main hall of Conrad Castle, where they were already greeted by members of the Pendragon family. Holding the hem of her dress, Lady Luna bowed as she greeted the hosts on behalf of the Seyrod family. Putting her hand on her heart, she breathed out that they had not seen each other for a very long time. Milady Helena approached her son, pushing him towards the bride. Eileen rushed to the girl, hugging her tightly while she was glad that they had finally met. Milady Helena thanked her for coming, then asked Raven to show the guests to their rooms. Watching this, Lady Luna mentally snickered that he hadn't changed at all, and couldn't give her basic help without her mother's guidance. The boy silently approached the guest, calling her after him to show her rooms. At this turn of events, she even cried quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. Turning his head to face her, Raven wondered if she would be upset about having a separate room for her guard. However, she was so shocked that she couldn't even answer him, so he asked if she could hear him. However, gathering herself, she coughed, then raised her hand, assuring the boy that she did not mind. Raven narrowed her eyes and looked at her bride, remembering Eileen's words about Lady Luna being a calm and polite girl. However, he didn't expect her to have such an honor with a groom she hadn't seen in 3 years. From this, he explained that the marriage was arranged. Lindsay opened the door to the room, inviting the young gentleman and his bride into the room. They went into the middle, where there was already a tea set for 2. Lindsay approached Raven, asking him if he would make tea with his guest, to which he nodded in the affirmative. Turning his head to the bride, the boy pointed with his finger, saying that she can sit where she likes. Lady Luna froze again, trying to comprehend what was happening before her eyes. She remembered how, upon meeting him, he was afraid to even raise his eyes to look at her, and now he was talking to the maids and even to her. After hearing her say that he had changed, Raven turned his head to her, questioning her, asking if he remembered her. Slumping into a chair, the boy confirmed that he had indeed lost his memory and only remembered his awakening, asking him not to take offense at him. Sitting down in the chair, Lady Luna wondered if he could have woken up from his coma as a different person. However, she was more interested in when he managed to become such a prominent man. Looking at the proud profile of the bridegroom, the girl understood that the past Ellen was only a shadow of the one sitting in front of her. Lady Luna's cheeks flushed at the thought that since he had become like this, the Pendragon family was not hopeless. Sensing a close eye on him, Raven turned to face his guest. He still couldn't understand the difference between the families, so he didn't know what it would be like to show disrespect to the Seyrods, but he understood that the guest was hiding something, and it was obvious. Smiling, the boy decided to ask her a few clarifying questions. He said that many people had told him about the changes in behavior, and he understood very well that she might not like them. However, hearing that the boy wanted to discuss something with her father, Lady Luna cut him off by putting her hand forward in protest. However, quickly pulling herself together, the girl began to apologize for her manners. Clenching her fists on the skirt of her dress, she began to chastise herself for the fact that her father had already wanted to break off the engagement, and she had only come to inform him of this. Raven watched the girl's movements, who clearly wanted to say something, but doubted the correctness of the words. Staring at him with wide eyes, Lady Luna tried to convince herself that the Pendragon family could not be saved despite the changes she had seen. Biting her lip, the girl mustered the courage to inform the boy about this right now. However, as soon as she turned to him, Lindsay's figure appeared in the doorway. The maid timidly apologized for disturbing the young master and his guest. Turning his gaze to the girl, Raven asked her what happened, to which she said her mother was calling him. However, he didn't even move, asking why now. Lindsay huffed, picking up her words, and informed her that the knight who had arrived with Lady Luna had picked a fight. Upon hearing this, Lady Sayrod fell into a stupor, her eyes wide open. Seeing Pendragon's attentive gaze on her, she mentally cursed the idiot she had asked to be polite a few minutes ago. Leaning his hand on the table, Raven asked the guest with a wide smile what she was up to, because he noticed it from the very threshold. However, she only began to deny his assumptions, stammering and averting her eyes. She thought about defying Pendragon and telling him the truth, but when she looked into his eyes, she couldn't. As she was choosing her words, Raven turned around, saying that he would talk to her after he dealt with her knight. Standing up, Lady Luna thought she really should deal with Sir Breeden first, so she followed her fiancé. Meanwhile, the throne room was not quite quiet. Melbourne was outraged by Lord Sayrod's decision to break off his engagement to House Pendragon. In response to the old man's question, Sir Breeden held up his hands, confirming that this was what they had come for. Milady Helena's face contorted into a grimace of rage as she reminded the knight of the consequences of such a decision. The same, putting his hand to his chest, assured that he perfectly understands the consequences. So, as an apology, Lord Sayrod offers the Pendragons a gold mine and the location of the crystal. The offer also included 2 sawmills on the territory of the Brynjar forest. Hearing this, the Duchess tensed slightly, realizing that the offer was quite generous. Melbourne also did not immediately find the words to answer something. With a wry smile, Sir Breeden added that such a decision did not sit well with the peasants, miners, and knights, so the Pendragon family should have something to offer as well. At these words, the Duchess and her advisor were almost twisted with anger. Milady Helena gritted her teeth, thinking that their coffers had dwindled quite a bit, but their family's honor was worth much more. Throwing her hand forward, she shouted that House Pendragon was refusing their offer. Squinting, the knight clarified if this was the final answer, as it was their only chance to stay afloat. However, as soon as Milady Helena wanted to answer him, she heard her son's voice. She looked up at the door and her eyes widened in surprise. A guard standing in the hall dropped to one knee when she saw Duke Pendragon at the door. Behind him, frowning, stood Lady Luna, her hands clasped in a castle. Both Mother and Melbourne smiled widely when they saw the boy. A predatory grin spread across Sir Breeden's face as he could now show his lady that he was not worthy of her. Raven walked past him and wearily sat down in the chair. Sir Breeden, on the other hand, continued to ramble on about the fact that they had not seen the Duke for a long time. However, he only calmly interrupted him, asking with whom he had the honor to speak. The knight fell silent, stretching his lips in a wide, uncomprehending smile. Raven waved his hand, explaining that he had lost his memory and didn't remember anything until he woke up. Thinking that he should put the Duke in his place, he bowed apologetically and began to introduce himself, but the Count interrupted him again. With a wave of his hand, Raven sent him away, saying that he would not speak to a mere knight. For some reason, he was indignant that he was a marshal, and the young Duke should have chosen his words better. Raven replied that he was behaving impolitely in the house of a great family, so it would be worth thinking about his behavior, while warning that he would not repeat it a third time. Sir Breeden looked down sullenly, not daring to contradict the young Pendragon, and Lady Luna approached from behind. Hearing Ellen's voice, which was already addressing her, the girl turned to him in fright. The guy looked at her with a smile, saying that she should have told her about breaking off the engagement right away. He beckoned her to him with his finger, adding that he wanted to speak with someone of his own level. But she came closer, looking at the young duke with big, frightened eyes. Raven said he was fine with her father's proposal, and she was fine with him. These words shocked not only Lady Luna, but also Milady Helena and Melbourne. After hearing vulgar words from her son, the Duchess with horror began to go through the options of where he could hear them. Melbourne also rushed to the young gentleman, asking him to wait with the decision, because it was quite serious and required a meeting. However, Raven jumped up, telling him that much needed to be done to restore House Pendragon to its former glory. Besides, there were matters more important than any engagement. He understood very well that regardless of his actions, Lord Seyrod would not change his decision, which is what he asked Lady Luna to confirm. But she started stuttering again, unable to find the words she needed to answer. She clutched at the hem of her dress again, clenching her fists tightly, realizing that she couldn't do what she came here for. With the same blush on her cheeks, the girl admitted to herself that she had managed to fall in love with the boy. Without waiting for an answer from her, Raven added that he accepted Lord Seyrod's terms, since the issue of his daughter's marriage would be decided by him anyway. Not listening to what Lady Luna had to say, the boy turned back to his mother, asking if she minded. She replied with a smile that since he was Duke Pendragon, the decision should be made by him. Raising his hand, he announced to everyone present that as of today, the engagement between the Pendragon and Seyrod families was cancelled. After these words, a shadow of grief appeared on Lady Luna's face. Sir Breeden stood silent, his teeth gnashing with fury, and Melbourne and Milady Helena had a calm smile on their faces. Already walking down the corridor, Raven thought about the fact that, despite the headache, he also had to deal with his engagement. However, putting his hand to his chin, the boy thought that he had been listening to Eileen for a good reason, and now he knew everything about the Pendragon family's financial situation. As he passed the large portrait, he thought that the crystals were an important resource for magic, and that they would be able to employ battle mages if desired. At some point, he noticed something, which made him raise his head and look at the picture. Looking at him from there was the same elderly woman he had seen when he regained consciousness, and who had calmed the dragon with a single movement. Pointing his finger at her, the boy asked Lindsay, who was following him, who she was, to which he was told that she was Lady Atia, his late grandfather's sister. Without taking his eyes off the portrait, he quietly and slowly repeated the woman's name. Immediately after that, Raven heard a voice behind him, causing him to turn his head sharply there. The same woman was standing by the high window, saying that she had a conversation with him. Closing the door of his room behind them, the boy asked what exactly she wanted from him. Raising her finger up, the woman replied that he had already guessed that she was a ghost, and he had summoned her himself by calling her name. Sitting across from her and crossing his arms over his chest, Raven thought that he had seen various demons over the past 10 years, but this was the first time he had seen a ghost, although he should have gotten used to surprises. However, his thoughts were interrupted by Lady Atia herself, who offered to go straight to the point. The smile left her face as she asked the boy who he was, clarifying that he was definitely not Ellen Pendragon. At her words, Raven only managed to open his eyes wide in surprise. Seeing his reaction, the woman laughed, saying that she couldn't help but say it in an ominous voice. She knew at once that he was not Ellen, as Soldrake had told her earlier that day that he was not the real Pendragon. In response, Raven relaxed against the back of the couch, asking the woman to explain to him what was going on around her. However, Atia instead asked him to tell how he became Ellen, since she herself did not understand anything. Looking closely at the woman, the boy wondered if he could be open with her, if he was the only one who could talk to her. Propping his elbows on his knees, Raven agreed to tell her everything as it happened. For a while at the end of his story, he added that he thought he was dead until he woke up in Ellen's body, and now it was up to him to find out what had happened. Seeing Atia shaking her head, putting her hand to her face, he wondered if she believed him. To this, the woman replied that she believed it or not, but Soldrake confirmed that he had indeed taken up residence in Ellen's body. However, she added that Ellen, whom he protected during the battle, was most likely an imposter. Hearing this, the boy looked at the interlocutor in a daze. Lady Atia explained that each generation of the Pendragon family had to make a pact with Soldrake to fight for them. She also explained that the Pendragon family mausoleum contained a treasury, magical ancestral altars, and Soldrake's helper spirits. And in his tower, there was a laboratory where you can see the secrets of their kind. The opening of the mausoleum shows whether the family will be great in this generation. If this does not happen, the family will face decline. That's exactly what Raven should have done. Soldrake could only pass up a true Pendragon who would be strong on the battlefield as well as in diplomacy, and there could be only one attempt. The woman added that even Ellen's grandfather and father had a hard time passing the test, and Ellen himself, who was considered the weakest man in the family tree, was even more unable to pass it, which is why he fell into a coma for 3 years. This happened to every defeated, and of course the dragon would not listen to him. Hearing that this was why he couldn't see Ellen leading the dragon to the battlefield, Raven looked at the woman in bewilderment. But in the next moment, Atia came sharply to his face, raising her finger up, while adding that it wasn't even about that. The woman said, with a smile, that now Ellen's body was occupied by someone else's soul. Looking at her calmly, Raven wondered what was going on, but she explained that since he has another soul, he can try to make a pact again. Calling him Raven, Atia warned that the Pendragon Knights could not help him in this. He himself needed to go to the forest of Ancona and defeat the creatures that lived there. In this way, he had to advance further into the thicket. There the boy had to find a mausoleum, where he could show Soldrake his power and make a pact with him. Then, being in union with the dragon, he will be obliged to open the doors of the mausoleum for the glory of the House of Pendragon. Raven listened to the interlocutor with wide eyes. She looked at the boy with a smile, asking if he could handle such a task. At this, Raven simply smiled widely, showing the answer to her question with his appearance. At the same time, he assured the woman that for the sake of the glory of Pendragon's house, he was ready to work as a demon destroyer. The boy added that he had his own plans for the future, which included the restoration of the Pendragon family's reputation. Lady Atia thought with satisfaction that the interlocutor was determined and purposeful. The woman added that she would not disturb him after he opened the mausoleum, as that was the only thing she needed. Raven scratched his head tiredly, thinking that he still had to deal with the family's vassals, as the family's reputation had been destroyed due to Ellen's behavior. Clapping her hands, Atia noticed with satisfaction that he had already thought of many things himself, adding that he had to prove himself a worthy Pendragon. Concluding that he needed to deal with the vassals and prepare for the mausoleum battle, so he could handle it in 2 weeks, Raven slapped his knees. Kneading his wrists, the boy assured the interlocutor that he would try to bring order here. Raven wasted no time in training, remembering the instructions he had heard when he was a fighter. He understood very well that it was necessary to assess their size, number, and style of attack. Remembering the monsters with which he fought, the boy understood that he was completely alone, and he had no allies. That was the only way he could avoid the end that had already happened. Raven was so engrossed in training that he didn't even notice Lindsay watching him raptly. She approached him, bringing him fresh clothes. Ignoring the embarrassed girl, Raven changed his shirt, thinking that Ellen's body was very weak after waking up. However, he managed to achieve the same form that he had in just a few days of training, while being happy that the regeneration was preserved. Someone's voice was heard from behind, enthusiastically exclaiming that the young Duke was engaged in fencing. Sir Killian added with a smile that he was happier than ever to see the changes in the young lord. With a wink, the man invited him to train together, promising that the training would be like before the coma. However, the boy refused, promising that they could do it another time, and for now asked him to gather the knights to make the announcement. Sir Killian just looked at the young master in surprise, not understanding what had just happened. For some time, in the main hall of the Conrad Castle, soldiers stood in front of him, to whom he wanted to tell important news. In a calm voice, the boy announced that he plans to open the mausoleum soon. Everyone present gasped in surprise, looking at the Duke in fear. Sir Killian rushed to ask the young master not to go there alone, warning that there were a lot of monsters and 2 days of training was very little. However, Raven, placing a hand on his chin, assured him that he would be able to cope, for which he asked to report on the situation there. He replied that the situation was bad because there were more monsters and robbers. The villagers fight them alone, but soon they will break through the forest fence. However, this did not convince the boy, so he repeated again that he would go there himself. Here Melbon intervened, who asked him to wait, because thanks to his decision, the treasury was replenished with Searod gold, so the mission can be entrusted to Sir Killian. At this, Raven reminded the advisor that they didn't have enough soldiers to guard the mine anyway. Having said that they are issued in 15 days, he added that objections are not accepted. However, Sir Killian did dare to object, insisting that he would be the one to command the squad. Descending the stairs, Raven asked with a smile if he thought he was incapable of leading an army, to which the knight pointed out that he preferred drawing and reading. To his refusal to fight with the young duke, the boy replied that he did not have the honor of a knight. In the next moment, he attacked the commander, but he quickly put his sword in front of him, blocking the blow. Big drops of sweat covered his face as the man marveled at how hard the blow had been. Raven looked at his opponent, offering to prove his word in battle. He, without thinking long, waved his sword, attacking the young duke. However, Raven jumped up, drawing her sword as she went. Trying to attack again, Sir Killian squinted one eye as he swung his sword. Staring wildly at the young duke, he growled that he could not be defeated by a boy who had been bedridden for years. However, in the next moment, Raven knocked the sword out of the man's hands with one blow. Having hidden the sword in its sheath, the boy struck his opponent in the chest with one precise movement, which caused his eyes to widen. Crouching in half, Sir Killian tried loudly to catch his breath after the impact. A moment later, Raven, with her hand in her pocket, was staring at him with an indifferent gaze. The same fell from a strong blow just under the young man's feet. Everyone present looked at this picture with their mouths wide open. Turning his back on the warriors, Raven repeated to them that the march would be in 15 days, and there he would make a pact with the dragon. Looking at them carefully, he asked them again if they had any objections to this. They fell on their knees before him, answering in unison that they had no objections. Meanwhile, Lady Luna was sitting in the guest room drinking tea. Hearing her being called, the girl looked up at the guest who had disturbed her. Sir Breeden burst into the room, demanding an explanation from her as to why she had agreed to go with Ellen to the mausoleum. Beating his chest, he reminded her that the engagement was already off and the Duke wasn't coming back alive anyway, so she could just go home. At this, the lady exhaled, explaining that diplomacy had never been his strong point, so she began to explain her decision. Looking at him, Lady Luna said that the Pendragons, like the Seyrods, were among the bloodlines closest to the Emperor, and thus they were an important factor in the success of their line. She had to know what they were up to and what their plan was, so she delayed returning home. Sir Breeden listened to her, his teeth clenched in rage. Leaning towards the girl, the knight asked the lady to promise him that she would go with the expedition to the Belland Gate, after which she would return with him to Lord Seyrod. Lady Luna herself was thinking about Ellen, and that the opening of the mausoleum would restore the glory of the Pendragon family, and it was necessary to know what the boy was capable of. At the mention of the Duke, her cheeks flushed again. Looking at the maiden, Sir Breeden thought with fury that Ellen had managed to turn her head despite the fact that he had humiliated him. Confronting himself, the knight mentally swore to himself that he would teach the young Duke a lesson that it was dangerous to get out of the castle. In 2 weeks, Raven stood in armor of the colors characteristic of the Pendragon family. Hearing him being called, the boy turned his head to the sound. The next second, he was in the arms of Milady Helena, who asked him to promise that he would return alive. Closing his eyes, Raven smiled and assured the woman that he would return as soon as he reclaimed the mausoleum from the White Dragon. Pouring tears over his shoulder, she replied that now he simply had to do it. When she left, the boy's gaze caught the figure of Aileen holding little Mia in her arms. Both looked at him with big blue eyes full of tears. Smiling at them as well, Raven assured them that he would definitely return alive. Lindsay came up to him, handing him the horse's stirrup and reminding him that it was time to go. With one sharp movement, the boy jumped onto the horse, which made him turn his head. The boy's gaze fell on his squad, which, in addition to the warriors, included Lindsay, Sir Killian, Lady Luna, and her guard. Melbourne handed the young lord a sword called the Widow's Grief, and was a family heirloom. Taking the sword in his hands, Raven mentally swore that with his victory, he would restore the Pendragon clan to its former glory, and thereby he will rid the Volte family of the brand of traitors. Thinking that he now had a purpose again, the boy raised his sword in the air, giving the order to leave. Looking up at the sky, he exclaimed that they stood for the glory of the Pendragon family. Holding flags with the family coat of arms in their hands, the soldiers rushed after him. As soon as they approached the forest, they were attacked by a pack of demonic wolves. Their eyes were glowing red, and saliva was dripping from their mouths. Seeing this, Sir Killian turned his head to the young lord to warn him of the danger. However, he was not confused, calmly answering that they would simply kill them. In a moment, the boy was swinging his sword, slashing wolves left and right. Turning his head to the army, Raven commanded them to advance. Sir Killian and Lindsay responded with broad, pleased smiles at the order. But on the faces of Lady Luna and Sir Bryden, you could read clear anxiety and fear. As they neared Belland Keep at sunset, Raven spurred his horse, ordering the pack to halt. Turning to Sir Killian, the boy ordered him to tell the soldiers to wait here while he himself scouted the situation. Local soldiers at this time carefully watched the newly arrived soldiers. Lindsay's voice came from behind him, wondering if he was tired from the road. The girl handed him a glass of water, looking at him with big eyes. Raven walked over to Lindsay, dusting her face with his thumb and letting her go about her business, dismissing her from work for the day. When she said that she could not rest, he added that he would go to the fortress himself, repeating the order to rest. She looked down at this and quietly agreed. In the middle, the boy saw that the situation was even worse than he expected, as the lack of people and resources was immediately apparent. The next noticeable aspect was the ammo, even worse than the demon fighters. Raven squinted, realizing that the local knights, who were at one of the important strategic facilities, had relaxed too much. The boy immediately turned to Sir Killian, wondering where he could find the local knights in their command. However, he paused, scratching his cheek and trying to find the right words to answer. After being informed that the local army had deserted, Raven's face twisted. Without folding his hands, Sir Killian added that he had been informed yesterday that they had become robbers, and that those who remained were practically useless. The boy hissed loudly, calling them an undisciplined scumbag. Waving to Sir Killian and the guard, Raven ordered them to tell the rest of the squad that they were going today to kill the gang. Turning his head towards them, he warned that they would mutilate the deserters. Meanwhile, in the abandoned monastery of the village of South Norton, deserters were drinking just on the steps of the altar, discussing the latest news of the Pendragon family. Several frightened villagers were sitting in front of them, and the bodies of those who had already been killed lay around. Sitting in his office, Raven was telling Sir Killian and Sir Bryden that he needed more men for tomorrow's raid on the deserters. Sir Killian, however, replied that it could endanger the entire fortress city. However, Sir Bryden replied that in gratitude for the fact that he and Lady Luna were staying at Conrad Castle for a few days, Count Sirad lent them his knights, who would go with them to battle. Looking at the knight with an indifferent look, Raven thought he was up to something, but decided to give him a chance to try anyway. Glancing at Sir Killian again, the Duke guessed that not everyone might like the fact that they left the fortress under the protection of the Sirad family. However, he assured that this is not the case, and there is no time for quarrels now, because Del Joffrey, who gathered the gang, has recruited 25 people, and in time, there may be more of them. Raven smiled as he praised the commander, while also asking him to tell him about the leader of the gang. He said that Del Joffrey was a good swordsman with a very high self-esteem. After the Duke's defeat with the dragon, he claimed the title and 3 acres of land near the fortress. However, the Duchess did not consider his talents and refused this request. The enraged knight left the castle, then deserted and dragged many with him. And now he was an ordinary robber trading in the village of South Norton. Putting a hand to his chin, Raven thought that the tactic of capturing lands instead of protecting them made life much easier, and he would have done the same himself. However, Sir Killian went on to say that he was enslaving the children and women, the village was ruined, and if they left it like that, they would soon capture the fortress. Pointing his finger at a point on the map, Raven began to explain his chosen tactic. After that, he poked his finger at Sir Killian, appointing him the commander of the raid. The boy explained with a smile that he was once their commander, but the Duke, who had been in bed for several years, they could take worse, and there would be no conversation. The man thumped his chest, assuring him that the young gentleman could count on him. Looking at the commanders, Raven added that Sir Bryden would be with him, while they would need to leave from the very morning, after which he let them go. However, at the very exit, the boy called out to Sir Killian, due to which he turned in surprise in his direction. The Duke said he would like to apologize for what happened in the throne room. After these words, tears flashed in the commander's eyes. He got down on one knee, thanking him for the mercy, considering that he was alive and well, and it was his own fault in this situation. Raven smiled as he added that he was counting on their victory tomorrow. The district of the village of South Norton was littered with the bodies of villagers with arrows sticking out of their bodies. Those who managed to survive were trampled by horses, ignoring their cries. Joffrey on horseback, sword raised, ordering his minions to take whatever valuables they could find. At the same time, the order was also not to leave anyone alive. Looking at the leader, one of the women was holding a little girl tightly to her chest, begging him to at least spare her. The chief replied that they were on his land, and at the same time they dared to listen to him. Dismounting from his horse, the fat man pointed his sword at them, reminding them that non-payment of tribute was punishable by execution. The woman closed her eyes tightly and continued to hold her daughter to her and continued to beg him for mercy. In the next moment, she felt a sharp pain, and blood gushed from the wound on her forehead. The girl began to shake her murdered mother, trying to bring her to consciousness. However, at some point she turned her head, looking at the man standing above her. Throwing his sword over his shoulder, Joffrey said with a smile that he can't stand loud children, wishing the girl sweet dreams. She froze in fear while tears streamed down her face. When the matter was finished, one of the peasants ran up to him, reporting that there was nothing to take in the surrounding villages, to which he replied that it was time to go to the fortress. Biting his finger, Joffrey added that after the fortress they would take Conrad's castle, where he would finish off the Duke and then marry his mother. His plan was to conquer the Pendragons and take the throne himself. At this time, Raven and his squad were approaching the village where they were supposed to meet the gang. Having carefully assessed the landscape, the boy thought that the lands had long been abandoned, as they were not even cultivated. Returning to Sir Killian, the Duke asked him if all the lands around him were so unusable, to which I received an answer that there are about 3/4 of them. The population is dying out and cannot ask for protection in the fortress, as the forests around are teeming with demons. Raven thought that he will have to deal with all this, because if the village is rebuilt and inhabited by hard-working villagers, it will grow quickly. Suddenly a noise was heard in the branches of the tree above them, and dark feathers began to fall down. Thinking it might be a gargoyle, the Duke raised his hand, ordering everyone to get ready. In the next moment, a monster flew at them, sticking out its tongue. Its face was eerily white, and there were orange circles around its eyes. Raven prepared to attack, drawing her sword. He looked at the harpy with a smile, thinking that it was time for him to relax a little. The boy swung his sword, trying to attack the creature, which rushed at him with a wild cry. In the next moment, Raven ordered that he needed 5 good crossbowmen. Immediately following his order, 5 armed young soldiers came forward. The Duke looked at the monster, ordering them to take her alive. The harpy thrust her clawed paws forward, attacking the squad members, but arrows were already flying at her, knocking her down. Looking at the monster's body, Raven praised the warriors for a job well done. Sir Killian came up to him, saying that there were a lot of demons here, as he thought, to which the Duke immediately agreed. Their conversation was interrupted by a rustling in the bushes near which they were standing. In a moment, 3 goblins were running at them, swinging their weapons. Quickly orienting himself, the commander shouted a command, trying to cover the young man. However, the next moment he fell silent, seeing how the bodies of the goblins were flying in different directions. The Duke himself stood calmly holding the sword with which he had just scattered the attackers. In a second, all of them, including the harpy, were already standing in front of him. Moreover, if the look of the harpy spoke very clearly about her intention towards the blond boy, the goblins did not understand what had happened. Sir Killian rushed forward, expressing his desire to finish off the monsters. However, Raven turned his head in his direction and objected, explaining that they would become their assistants. This time, not only the commander was surprised, but also all the soldiers present, who stood with their mouths wide open. The Duke explained that goblins had excellent eyesight, and the harpies could fly very fast, which could be useful to their squad, as he himself was thinking about where to get helpers. Sir Killian approached him, saying that he had never heard of demons being taken as assistants, prompting Raven to almost blurt out the practices of the exterminator camp. So he calmly answered that whether it was demons or people, he would not mind any help now. The boy approached one of the goblins and asked what they were doing outside the forest, to which I received the answer that they were driven from the hunting grounds by stronger creatures such as harpies, ghouls, wolves, orcs, and white dragons. Raven chuckled as he heard the names say, adding that he could understand their situation. Then, pointing at the harpy with his sword, he asked if she ate people, to which she shook her head in denial, assuring that she only eats sheep and snakes. The Duke looked at her in disbelief, wondering if it was true. He remembered how he once saw a scavenger harpy in one of the villages. Hearing that he was ready to believe her, the creature rushed to thank him loudly for this. However, sharply grabbing the harpy by the neck, he brought the sword, adding that from now on they must serve only him, because for disobedience, he will feed them to the dragon. The goblin clung to the harpy's feathers, and they both rushed to assure him fervently that they would serve him in faith and truth. And while his squad stood behind, their companies gaping in surprise, Raven gave his first order to his new assistants, which was to find the shortest possible route to the village of South Norton. Immediately after that, the three-horned goat pointed somewhere with his finger and rushed there, saying that he knew the way very well. Sir Killian, who approached him, spoke enthusiastically that he admired him and that they would all like to learn from the young master. Raven looked at him and smiled, agreeing with his words. He added that soon all the stubborn and disobedient would learn about the power of his mind. After some time, the boys' squad moved through the empty streets of the village. Ahead of them rode a harpy, waving merrily and boasting that he had found the shortest route. Raven looked at the commander, ordering him to stay here while he and Sir Breeden went to the abandoned monastery. Lady Luna rode behind, lost in her thoughts about how worried she was for the young duke. However, Sir Breeden threw her over his shoulder that she could rest easy as he would be there to protect her. Raven turned his head to his squad, ordering the soldiers to advance. Harpy and Kazul, hearing the task of conducting reconnaissance from the sky, immediately rose up, obeying the command of the commander. At this time, the young duke himself was already galloping on his horse, drawing his sword as he went. At this time, on the road to the monastery, Joffrey was dragging a small boy by the scruff of his head while his bound mother was being dragged by a rope. The woman, with tears in her eyes, begged to let at least the child go, to which the leader barked at her to thank them that they were still alive. The boy burst into tears, struggling in the executioner's hand and calling his mother for help. Turning him to face him, Joffrey brought up a metal-gloved fist, telling the boy to shut up. The desperate cry of his mother, who tried to stop him, was heard from behind. In the next moment, the same fist flew into the air, describing a bloody arc. The rest of the body, which was still called Joffrey, lunged at the cut brush, not understanding what had happened. Raven sat on his horse, aiming his sword directly at the robber. He looked frightened at the rider, but did not know who it was, since the bright light did not allow him to see his face. The boy, whom he wanted to kill just a second ago, crumpled to the ground, still crying. Finally, he saw that the horse was none other than Ellen Pendragon. Slamming the Hepa to the ground, Joffrey pointed a finger at him, at a loss for words. The woman whom he was dragging on the rope a moment ago looked at the young gentleman with eyes full of tears, in which great hope could be read. Slinging his sword over his shoulder, Raven smiled as he told the outlaw that he was glad to finally meet such scum. The members of the squad did not intervene, instead watching the young duke while the woman hugged her son tightly, who climbed into her arms. Joffrey pointed a finger at Pendragon, still unable to say anything. All his followers could not understand where the young duke came from. At some point, the leader felt the touch of a cold sword, and a hot drop ran down his cheek. Staring a murderous glare at the outlaw, Raven menacingly asked if anyone had given him permission to speak. Freezing for a moment, Joffrey turned sharply and dashed off. Trying to run to the cops, he barked for them to kill the duke. They immediately rushed forward, obeying the order of their chieftain. However, Raven, watching this picture, was already drawing a second sword. Joffrey looked on in shock, not understanding what was happening and totally not expecting to see the duke with a weapon. With one sharp move, Raven slashed several bandits at once, knocking them out of the game. Watching his gang melt before his eyes, Joffrey struggled to understand how this was possible. When the blows were finished, the duke returned to the leader, bringing his sword over his head. He raised his hands in a half, trying to cover his head and protect himself. However, when he struck it, he heard the clink of sword metal against another sword. Squinting, Raven stared at the one who dared to protect the marauder and deserter from him. In front of Joffrey's corpse stood Sir Breeden, his sword in hand and blocking the young Pendragon's strike. Seeing this, Lady Luna let out a loud cry, glaring at her knight, but one of the warriors put out a hand to stop her. The same, turning his head to the leader of the robbers, asked him if he needed help. However, the one, shocked to look at the savior, could only ask who he was. Sir Breeden swung his sword, pushing the young duke away from him. When the robber got up, the knight introduced himself, adding that they could join forces to defeat Pendragon. Raven was silent, indifferently watching their dialogue. Suddenly, he heard Lady Luna's voice screeching at the guard, asking what he was doing. At the same time, the duke tried to push her away and ordered her to leave. Sir Breeden, pointing to himself, told her that she was too blinded to see that Ellen was worthless, and the only person she needed was the guardsman himself. Joffrey smiled as he looked at the savior and asked with a smile if he was a defector. However, jumping high in the air, the robber added that he was not against such a turn. Swinging their swords, they and Sir Breeden rushed at the Duke, saying that he would regret crossing their path, however. Seeing this, Lady Luna screamed loudly, scared to death for her former fiancé. She closed her eyes and turned away, but Raven thrust her sword forward, blocking both attacks at once. With one strong swing, the boy managed to push his opponents away from him at a decent distance. Turning his head to the girl, the Duke barked at her to finally move away from the battlefield, assuring her that she would be able to handle them. Summoning the three-horned knight to him, young Pendragon ordered him to look after Lady Seyrod. He obediently grabbed the girl by the hem of her dress, trying to drag her to a safe place while she was still reaching for the blonde. She looked anxiously at her ex-fiancé, realizing that Sir Breeden was the best knight, and a deserter bandit was helping him. Putting Lady Luna out of her mind, Raven turned her attention back to her duel with her rivals. Looking at him, the girl blushed awkwardly again. The Duke looked up at the harpy, ordering her to fly to Ser Killian and relay the news of help. In response, the creature flew up and screamed loudly as it obeyed the order. The attackers smirked, saying that he had sent the messenger too late, as they would deal with him until help arrived. However, Raven put the sword forward, saying that they could launch an attack. The boy, with a big smile on his face, added that he was challenging them both at once. Sir Breeden rushed forward, reminding the Duke that he had no experience in battle, and that he himself was the best knight. In the next moment, Raven was deftly dodging a sword strike when the guardsman lunged forward. However, immediately after that, the opponent stopped and stared in bewilderment at the broken sword, which simply split in half. He was so engrossed in this picture that he did not even notice how he was being attacked, and accordingly, missed a strong blow to the jaw. The blow was so powerful that the guard was sent flying backwards, knocking Joffrey off his feet. Already lying in a heap on the ground and rubbing his bruised cheek, both assailants were looking at the point of the sword that was glinting in the sun and aimed at him. Raven replied with a wide smile that with such a technique as the guardsman simply had no chance against him. The boy thrust his sword into Sir Breeden's leg, saying that he had been of great help to him when they were in the castle. The Duke then swung his sword, planning to hit the guard who was covering his head with both hands. In the next moment, he saw the blade of the sword, which cut off his arm right at the shoulder. His face turned pale and beaded with sweat as he clenched his teeth in pain. Collapsing onto his stomach and trying to cover the wound with his hand, Sir Breeden mumbled loudly. However, Raven walked up to him and stepped on his chest, ordering him to escort Lady Seyrod home. Looking menacingly at the knight, the Duke ordered him not to appear again in the lands belonging to the Pendragons. He looked at him, trembling with fear and pain, and tears appeared in his eyes. In a second he was already running in the direction of the thicket, screeching loudly. Raven, on the other hand, returned to the conversation with Joffrey, who continued to sit on the ground, covering his face in fear. Hearing the Duke's words that he was next, the robber asked if the Duke had not sold his soul to the devil. With a predatory smile, the man added that his people could still deal with him, because they were still sitting in the monastery. When he asked if he was going to kill the whole gang by himself, Raven only slightly stretched his lips in a smile. Keeping her out of his sight, the Duke reminded the robber that the Pendragons were famous for their knights. Immediately after that, the clatter of hooves was heard and knights began to approach them, holding the coats of arms of House Pendragon. Staring at the outlaw, Raven ordered the warriors to get to work. After that, the Duke told him that the knights would deal with his subordinates, but the chieftain himself did not see a quick death, considering his crimes. Realizing that he was finished, Joffrey covered his face with his hand as he looked at the young Duke in fear. The next moment, he felt a great pain when a horse stood on his chest. For some time, he was already hanging in the monastery, crucified on the altar. Duke Pendragon was calmly watching him, with Ser Killian standing next to him, and the captives were huddled behind him. Raven turned his head, looking at those who were held in the monastery by the robbers. They were thin, dirty, and disheveled, and looked very tired, and the shackles on their legs were torn. However, at some point the Duke's attention was drawn to the door, which opened, as behind it was a pile of skulls that spilled into the hall. For some time the boy looked there carefully, narrowing his eyes. After that, he approached the altar, asking where all the peasants from the surrounding villages were, and stabbed the body of the leader of the robbers with his sword, which caused him to wince and groan. Pointing to the skulls, the Duke asked him if it was the work of their hands. However, Joffrey only managed to squeeze out the words of apology as he spoke to himself. Raven furiously replied that in his opinion, he still treated him very mercifully. The robber looked up at the Duke, asking if he would kill him. However, young Pendragon replied that he would leave that decision to other people. A few drops of sweat rolled down Joffrey's face as he stammered out what he meant. However, Raven was no longer listening to him. Instead, he turned around and took a few steps towards the group of villagers. Watching them intently, the Duke allowed them to do as they pleased with their executioner. Joffrey raised his head, snarling in fear, as Pendragon listed the means of revenge against him. Immediately after that, the boy started for the exit, while the villagers, sitting on the floor, looked in his direction. For some time, they looked at each other, trying to understand what they should do now. A second later, a predatory glare appeared on their faces, and they began to approach the altar, holding stones and debris in their hands. Seeing the angry villagers, Joffrey screamed wildly, begging for mercy. However, they did not listen to him. They wanted to take revenge for all their brothers by striking the leader of the robbers. Raven, meanwhile, was walking along the narrow corridor of the abandoned monastery, heading for the door. Opening them, he raised his head, looking somewhere up. There he saw another altar on which stood a large statue of a woman. Climbing the stairs to the statue, the boy did not even pay attention to one of the robbers who was hiding behind it. When the Duke was close, he rushed at him with loud cries, swinging his sword violently. However, Raven didn't even look at him, instead putting her sword out to block the attack. The attacker's eyes widened in surprise as he had not expected such a rebuff. As the boy fell on the stairs, Pendragon stomped on his chest with an armored boot, causing the robber's face to contort into a grimace of pain. Without thinking long, the Duke swung his sword, attacking the marauder. After that, raising his head to the statue, the boy looked at the drops of blood that fell on her face. Raven turned to the goddess of light, asking if he was worth the curse for the murder committed in front of her. He added that although he was given a chance to be reborn, he did not want to spend his life under the curse. Without taking his eyes off the statue, the boy swore that he would respect those around him, but he would deal with the robbers. He slipped the locket from around his neck and dropped it into the offering box. Raven explained that he is such a person, and this is the path he chose for himself. Turning towards the exit, he asked that if he was going to be cursed, then let it happen after he had finished his business. With these words, he left the ruined hall. When the squad returned to the village of South Norton, the woman they rescued, holding her son in her arms, thanked the Duke, to which he said that it was not worth it. After adding that they should contact him if they need materials for the reconstruction of the village, the boy left the village to favorable reviews. Immediately after that, a Khazul with a harpy ran up to him, demanding a reward from his master for the work done. When they heard that he would do this in the camp, they smiled happily. Sir Killian, who was riding alongside, asked if now that they had saved the village of South Norton, they could go to Ancona Forest. However, the Duke replied that they had one more small matter to attend to before that. He remembered sitting in his office a few days ago talking to Lady Atia. It surprised him that she thought the orcs of Ancona Forest might be useful to them. She explained that they cannot leave the forest, but their fighting power is much higher than that of ordinary orcs. To this, the boy clarified what they would help him with, if they were not interested in anything other than murders and wars. To this, Atia winked at the interlocutor, adding that they would go after the strongest if he had the strength to defeat them. With a smile, the woman said that the dragon was the strongest creature of all, but he had not yet conquered Soldrake, and the orcs might know that the dragon had defeated Ellen. Hearing that the only way to prove his strength was to defeat the orcs personally, the boy let out a weary breath. Casting a glance at him, Lady Atia advised them to defeat them so that they would call him the god of bloodshed. After her question about whether he had ever fought orcs, Raven looked at her carefully, remembering the past. Before his eyes appeared a maw with huge fangs and gray-green skin, a spear sticking out of its chest. The boy remembered standing in front of him, holding a sword in his hands and being ready for the attack of the creature. Observing the opponent, the young demon slayer could not understand why the opponent was still standing if there was no living space on it. The orc reached for the hilt of one of the spears with his paw and, grabbing it, pulled it out of his body. Looking at the boy, the creature raised its sword and charged at the fighter. At the last moment, he managed to jump back, because of which the orc pounded with all his might with his weapon on an empty place. They looked at each other for a minute, trying to figure out what was going to happen next. The orc swung his sword again, intending to finish off the demon slayer with one blow. Preparing for this, Raven ducked, avoiding the monster's attack. Looking up at him, The boy thought that he was too exhausted to continue the battle. Looking at his opponent's wounds, the demon slayer thought that a spear to the heart would not help, so he should try to chop off the head. Seeing the orc attack again, Raven jumped up sharply, increasing the distance between them. He ducked his head for a moment, avoiding the swing of the orc's sword. Without wasting time, the boy lunged forward, holding his sword in front of him. In the next moment, in a simple leap, he plunged his weapon into the monster's mighty neck. Finding support in the form of the monster's shoulder, Raven pressed harder on the handle, knocking the opponent to the side. In a second, he already flew to the side, followed by the orc's head. Raven told Lady Atya that it was the orc wormwood that happened to him in the early days of his exile. Crossing his arms over his chest, he added that he had defeated him, but the battle seemed difficult. Despite this, he was confident of his victory. At these words, the woman raised her thumb up, smiling that everything should work out for them. She added that after defeating the orcs of Ancona, opening the mausoleum would be a much easier task. Raven narrowed one eye suspiciously, looking at the interlocutor and not doubting her words. His squad was now approaching high, steep mountains surrounded by dense forest. Sir Killian met the young master's idea of making the Ankan orcs their allies with great skepticism. To this the Duke replied that they had too few men to reach the mausoleum, but he warned that they could destroy them if they lost. A harpy suddenly landed in front of his horse, on whose back sat a Kazul, which confirmed the commander's words. Harpy also joined the conversation, adding that the orcs were killing everyone, and she didn't want to die. However, Raven, ignoring their words, ordered them to think about how to defeat the orcs, otherwise they would go into the mouth of the dragon. Hearing someone shout from behind, Pendragon turned his head back. Looking around, Sir Killian was surprised to recognize the voice of Sir Breeden, to which Pendragon stated that he had not yet left his lands. Kazul put a hand to his eyes, staring into the distance, then informed the commander that he could see the orcs of Ancona. Hearing that the orcs were there, Raven smiled, feeling the fun coming. Sir Killian's face showed anxiety and fear. However, Raven, having spurred his horse, rushed to the side where the screams could be heard, ignoring the shouts of the commander. Sir Breeden at this time held his sword in one hand, his eyes wide with fear. Next to him, with the same look, was Lady Luna, trying not to make any unnecessary movements. The knight sat on the ground while his horse hooted from behind, and 5 orcs stood in front of the man. Frowning, Lady Luna reflected on the fact that traveling alongside Sir Breeden had brought nothing but trouble. When they were left alone in the village, the girl reprimanded him decently for attacking Duke Pendragon, which was tantamount to rebellion. Hearing that he might be driven away, the knight rushed to beg him not to, as he still had to accompany her to the Sayrod lands. Looking at him sternly, Lady Luna reminded him that his job was to protect her, so he should remember his place, and her father would decide his fate. He lowered his head and clenched his teeth tightly, not daring to argue with the lady. Ignoring him, the girl turned around, announcing that her business in the Pendragon lands was complete. And now the orcs looked with contempt at the one-armed knight who dared to raise his sword at them, asking if he was really going to fight them. Fear and despair filled Sir Breeden's eyes with impotent tears. Suddenly, Duke Pendragon's voice rang out from the side, asking what was going on here. The orc turned his head in interest to where the unknown voice was coming from. Sir Breeden's face showed a look of embarrassed astonishment, and Lady Luna looked at her ex-fiancé with wide eyes. Raven stared at the company with an indifferent gaze. A guardsman rushed to him without wasting time, begging him to save them from the orcs. Looking at him, Pendragon wondered how someone like him could ever be knighted. A squad was already approaching him from behind, and Sir Killian was calling for him to wait for them and not go to fight the orcs alone. Seeing the squad of warriors, the orc silently lashed out at them, not understanding what was happening. He understood perfectly well that the red banners belonged to the Pendragon family. Pointing a finger at the Duke, the orc snarled that he was the one he was looking for. At this, Raven only silently looked at the monster with a stern, attentive gaze. At some point, a dark energy began to emanate from the creature, which covered everyone present. Sir Killian knew instantly that he had cast fear magic as his throat was seized and hooked. The commander turned to the Duke, persuading the young gentleman to retreat, as all this was very dangerous. However, he only quickly jumped off his horse without saying a word. All the members of the squad looked at the Duke with wide eyes, wondering how he could move and why he went there unarmed. Raven's face remained calm. There was determination and confidence in his eyes as he ordered the soldiers to stay put and keep their swords sheathed. The boy approached the orc and stopped a few steps away from him. Hearing that the Duke was challenging him to a fight, The creature lunged at him in surprise. Smiling widely, Raven added that the fight would be one-on-one. At these words, all the goblins who were present looked at him in surprise. Kneading his fingers, the leader gave a predatory smile, and his eyes lit up with demonic fire. For a while, the Duke stood, studying his future opponent carefully. Raven asked the gang if they were really orcs of Ancon. The head orc bent down to get a closer look at the Duke and confirmed his words, asking what he needed. For a moment, the boy looked at his opponent, slyly narrowing his eyes. However, in the next moment, out of all stupidity, he hit him with his forehead on the bridge of his nose. The chief orc threw his head back, causing blood to splash from his nose in different directions. A slight triumphant smile bloomed on young Pendragon's face. The orcs watched in shock as their leader fell to the ground unconscious. They stood with their mouths wide open and could not believe their eyes. The same thing happened in the Duke's unit. However, due to the fact that Sir Killian was sure of the inevitability of the battle. But the next moment, the rest of the orcs laughed loudly at how their leader's nose was broken. Besides, a human did it with one blow. This reaction of the creatures surprised both Sir Killian and the harpy with the casual on her back. Karth, the head orc, jumped on the spot, asking his opponent what he was making, to which he heard the same question from the blonde. The boy reminded them that their tribe had taken an oath not to leave the forests of Ancona, and they were now very far from its edges. However, the creature replied that the oath had been broken, and it was the young Duke Pendragon who was to blame. Pointing a finger at him, Karth added that he had not been accepted by the keeper of the Ancon forest, and they refused to obey the vanquished. At the end of the speech, he said that they would only obey the guardian of Ancon, who was a white dragon. While he said that the boy had brought shame on his kind by failing to make a pact with the guardian, not a single muscle on the boy's face moved. He wondered if by great guardian of the forest the orc meant Soldrake. Karth continued that this was why they revoked their oath and went out into the surrounding lands to conquer them. Raven smiled, realizing that the orcs were simply called by a mad thirst for blood and also had other plans for them, despite the understanding that they would not obey him. Kneading his fingers, the boy said that this is why he himself went in search of the Ancon orcs. When the Duke noticed that he had approached him unarmed, Karth smiled, praising him for his good knowledge of their customs. After that, he let go of his club to be on the same level with his opponent. Crossing his arms over his chest, Raven said that according to their customs, if an opponent laid down their weapon, the orc should also lay down their weapons. Not accepting the challenge was a shame. So he added that following their traditions, he now challenged the leader to a battle. Extending a clawed paw, the orc rushed towards the Duke, attacking him. Raven jumped up, resting on the back of Karth's head, pushing him to the ground, causing him to fall. Glancing at his opponent, the boy thought that this one must really be the strongest in the group of orcs, as a human would have had his skull split open from such a blow. Karth raised his head to look at his opponent, who was slowly landing on the ground not far from him. However, in the next moment, the Duke turned around in mid-flight and swung his leg, attacking the orc again. At the last moment, he put his hand in front of him, covering his head from the blow. It was so strong that the ground under Karth's feet cracked deeply. Sir Killian, along with the harpy and the Kazal, watched with wide eyes. Lady Luna covered her mouth with her hand in fear as she watched the fight between her former fiancé and the orc leader. Raven looked down at the armored boot, a piece of armor chipped off by the attack. He looked at his opponent, realizing that he had enough strength but not enough dexterity, so he asked why he was not fighting at full strength. Flying out of a cloud of dust, the orc replied that he does not fight with humans at full strength, because they die too quickly. He considered the one who answered his blow as an equal. To this, Raven said that now he should start fighting at full strength. However, he had already attacked, promising that now he would learn what the true power of orcs was, rejoicing at the person with whom there would be an interesting fight. At the last moment, the Duke managed to turn his head a little so that Karth's fist did not crash into it. However, feeling a scratch on his cheek, the boy thought that the orc was not only strong, but also quite fast. Raven put a hand to her cheek as Karth stood across from him, trying to ease the pain a little. Rushing towards the boy again, the creature said it was just a warm-up and hoped he wouldn't die of fright. Putting up a block, the Duke stopped Karth's fist as it flew straight into his face. An ominous smile appeared on Sir Breeden's face, while Lady Luna put her hands to her mouth in fear. Sir Killian rushed to the place where the battle was taking place, and the harpy, whose eyes were filled with tears, began to shake altogether. There rose a high wall of chaos, and Karth froze in place with clenched fists. Looking at his fist, he thought about hitting his opponent. However, seeing him standing on his feet in a cloud of dust, he mentally cursed. A gash on the boy's forehead oozed blood, flooding his face as he said he had only had petty rivals before. Everyone present, including the gang of orcs, looked at the Duke in shock while smiling. Sir Killian also wondered how the young lord was still able to stand on his feet after such a blow. Gritting his teeth, the man thought about the fact that he must protect the heir of House Pendragon at all costs. But for the first time he saw someone survive after being hit by an orc. Without thinking long, Sir Killian ordered the squad to hurry to the aid of the young Duke. However, Raven put his hand forward, ordering his warriors to stop. Looking sternly at the commander, the boy said that this battle would take place between him and the orc face to face, and he did not need help. Sir Killian strongly disliked such an order, but gritting his teeth, he closed his eyes and obeyed. Suddenly there was loud applause from one of the goblins, coupled with a shrill laugh. Placing a hand on his chin, he said with a wide smile that it was an achievement for a human to survive the attack of Cart, who was the strongest in the forest. Watching the rivals converge on the hurts again, the orc concluded that Pendragon was indeed an interesting man. Kneading his fingers, the young Duke smiled and said that now it was his turn to show his strength. Karth replied that he was the only person who survived his attack, but he was injured and didn't have long to live. Grabbing his forehead, Raven laughed softly, replying that he was too quick to rejoice. Raising his mane, the boy showed his face, where only a small mark remained from the blow. Seeing this, the orc opened his mouth wide, wondering how the wound could heal so quickly. Without thinking long, Karth regrouped and rushed towards the young Duke again. Clasping his hands in a lock, he jumped up and hit the ground where the blond boy was standing. Jumping away from the place where the orc had hit, Raven thought that he just needed to land one clear blow to win. However, he understood that in order to do this, he first needed to somehow get his opponent off balance. Thinking that orcs are not distinguished by great intelligence and regeneration will help him himself, the Duke yelled at him that he had almost lost. Karth lunged at Pendragon, asking if he was tired of dodging his blows yet. Continuing to tease his opponent, Raven snorted that orcs only know how to swing their fists, because they don't have enough brains for other things. Rushing to the Duke, Karth growled that he would regret insulting their tribe. The blonde rested his palm on his knee, waiting for the next attack with a smile. In a jump, the orc brought his foot forward to strike the opponent with it. Swinging, he said that he would ram these words down his throat with one blow. Raven noticed that this was exactly what he had been trying so hard to achieve. He put up a block, protecting himself from Karth's leg, a slight smile blooming on his face. The impact was so strong that the armor on the hands simply tore as if they were made of paper. Seeing this, Sir Killian screamed, trying to draw the young master's attention to his injuries. Karth noticed this as well, saying that now that his arm was broken, he didn't have a chance. However, Raven only smiled as he grabbed his opponent's leg and told him that he was very wrong. Picking up the confused orc, the boy added that his arms were already intact. Karth stared at the Duke. Sure, he had broken his arm, and only then did it dawn on him that it was all a trap. Leaning against his leg, Raven jumped up, planning to knee him. Watching the opponent, the orc understood that now it was really over, since he could not dodge. With one clear movement, the Duke kicked him in the jaw, causing Karth to fly slightly away. The orc let out a loud sigh as he felt two teeth fly out of his mouth. Raven watched the defeated opponent in silence, looking at him with an indifferent gaze. Karth's landing was quite hard as he put his shoulder to the ground nicely. Sir Killian and the Kazul with the harpy watched in shock at their commander's victory. The faces of Lady Luna and Sir Bryden showed wild surprise and shock at the sight before them. A slight smile bloomed on the robed orc's face. The orcs were also smiling, not believing their eyes, but very pleased with the sight. Waving their fists in support, they rushed towards their brother, enjoying the incredible fight. Looking at the defeated leader, they were surprised to see him defeated. Karth became crabby, trying to get up with the help of his brothers. Sir Killian didn't wait any longer either, rushing over to the young lord to examine his hand. However, he puzzled him with the answer that nothing was needed and the hand was practically fine. The boy thought that the pain from the healing of the wound was much stronger than from the wound itself, although he was grateful for such strength. Moving his fingers, folding them into a fist, Raven breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that his hand was fully functional. He walked over to the group of orcs and Karth, who was still sitting on the ground rubbing his bruised jaw. With his hands at his sides, Raven turned to them, commanding them to obey him. Karth smiled predatorily, saying that he knew very well the need to follow the winner, so he asked what he needed. Looking at the leader of the gang, the Duke replied that they could help with the storming of the Ancona forest for a start. After hearing this, Karth was surprised, wondering why he was storming if he was his protector anyway. Raven replied that he was going to open the mausoleum. Hearing these words, the orc stared at him with big round eyes, the size of saucers. Getting to his feet, Karth asked in a disbelieving tone if the guardian spirit of the forest was going to make a deal with them. The Duke explained to the orc that by the time they reached Soldrake, there would be so many monsters there that the orcs would be sick of them. However, not noticing much enthusiasm, the boy asked if they were not happy about the prospect of fighting enemies every day. However, those following him explained that they do not consider weak monsters as opponents, so they will reach the mausoleum very soon. Raven approached one of the knights who was holding a red cloak and a sword. Karth, seeing the Duke draw his sword, quickly dropped to one knee. His brothers, after thinking for a second, did exactly the same, lowering their heads. Touching the shoulder of each of them with his sword, Raven urged them to dedicate their lives to the service of the Pendragons. Carefully watching the new allies, the blonde added that he was counting on their complete return. Lady Luna looked at it with a shocked look, unable to find the words to describe it. With impotent rage, Sir Breeden clenched his teeth tightly, grinding them together. Already on the bridge over the river, Raven told Lady Luna that he would leave a few warriors with them to get her and her knight home safely. She bowed, once again apologizing for the behavior of her subordinate. Hearing the Duke call to him, Sir Breeden flinched and looked at him. Pendragon warned that the next time he raised his sword against him, he wouldn't be able to pay for it with just one hand. The young Duke turned his horse around, but Karth, who was standing beside him, remained in place and watched the Seyrod guard unmoved. Noticing this, Raven threw him over his shoulder to follow him. Lady Luna wanted to say something else, so she lunged forward, her hand out and pushing Sir Breeden out of the way. However, seeing that the ex-fiancé was already engrossed in the conversation with the orc, she remained standing still. The girl drilled his back with a look of blue eyes and plunged deeper and deeper into thoughts. She saw a troop of warriors holding tightly to their saddles. Ahead of them, looking confidently ahead, rode the young Duke Pendragon. Beside him were Sir Killian, who was one of the best warriors in the Pendragon Guard in Karth, the strongest orc in Ancona Forest. The Duke's scouts were the Harpy and the Kazul, who faithfully followed his orders. And also on his side were other orcs who swore with their leader. With such data, Lady Luna was confident that Ellen would complete the dragon's task and be able to open the mausoleum. She was so engrossed in watching the departure of the squad that she didn't even pay attention to Sir Breeden's fierce look. It was late in the evening. Standing on the mountain, Raven inhaled the air, glad to finally see the forest of Ancona. He carefully studied the area, trying to remember as much as possible. Sir Killian did the same, deep in thought. Tears flashed in the eyes of the Harpies, because they and Kazul knew what creatures might be waiting for them in the thicket. And Kart's eyes were filled with a certain warmth, as if he had returned home. Raven said with a smile that this is where it all starts, and there will be a battle in which he should have participated long ago. Meanwhile, Soldrake raised his head, looking at the starry sky, where the sun was already slowly rising. Looking at the beginning of the dawn, the dragon sat on the pillar and felt the approach of the guest. Closing his eyes, he mentally said to him, "Let the one who is deprived of the Pendragon's soul try to reach his domain." Sunlight flooded the valley of Ancona Forest, where Pendragon's squad was already slashing demons left and right. Swinging his club, Karth smashed the torso of one of the hordes of snakes that attacked them. For the orcs, such creatures did not pose a big problem, so there was practically no interest in such duels. The warriors of House Pendragon looked more tired in contrast, being somewhat weaker than the orcs, but they were also getting by with swords and crossbows. However, the flying snakes did not even think of ending, so they rushed at the travelers again, sticking out their forked tongues. Raven managed just in time to chop down one of the creatures, which was rushing straight into the face of another knight. Putting his hand to his chest, he looked at the Duke with a certain adoration, heartily thanking him for his rescue. Returning to the cloaked goblin, whose name was Krathul, young Pendragon instructed him to treat the wounded. He laughed briefly, answering that he could not worry about it, since he knew something about treatment. Raven heard Sir Killian rush towards him, calling out to him and asking if the young lord was injured. He replied that everything was fine, instead asking how the rest of the squad was doing, to which he heard that there were practically no wounded. Hearing that they might kill some of the force if they ran into the demons again, the Duke turned to Karth, asking if they still had far to go. He closed his eyes, trying to remember, after which he said that if they go a little further, they will see a quarry. Pointing somewhere, he added that there would be a cave connected to the lands of the guardian spirit, so Raven immediately turned her head in that direction. When asked if there was anything to worry about, the orc replied that these lands still belonged to them, so there was no reason to worry. On the way up, the Duke said it was worth going on, proposing to set up camp near the quarry. Turning his head, he added that if there were any problems, he and the orcs would take care of them. Sir Killian and Karth immediately followed him, trying to keep up with the commander. As night fell, Raven stopped by a mountain in the middle of which was a quarry. The squad also stopped, scanning the empty plateau for an entrance. Looking around, Pendragon thought that the place seemed too dark and eerie for stone mining. Returning to Karth, Raven asked why the quarry was now sealed. Placing his hand on his chin, he replied that goblins used to mine it for minerals. However, there were rumors that the goblins had disappeared without a trace. Hearing this, the Duke turned his gaze to the Khazul, who was still sitting on the harpy. He immediately heard waving his hands, trying to convince the commander that he does not know anything since he does not live in the forest. In addition, he added that he had never heard of goblins extracting minerals themselves, as the norm was to steal. Sir Killian approached them, asking the young Duke if anything had happened to him. The Duke returned to the commander, ordering the tents to be pitched, as advancing before dawn was a rather dangerous undertaking. After hearing that they would have to be on duty during the night, Karth waved as he headed off to his fellows, wishing the rest of them a good night. After a while, everyone in the camp fell into a peaceful sleep, except for the guards. At some point, one of the knights heard a strange sound, which made him turn in that direction with interest. However, there was no one around on the plateau, so he actively began to look. Without thinking long, the boy moved away from the camp, trying to figure out what the sound was. However, in a moment, he felt a sharp pain from the blade that pierced his rib cage all the way through. Not even realizing what had happened, he only quietly tried to call out to the young Duke when he was thrown down the steps he was climbing. Landing not far from the camp, the boy once again tried to call Pendragon. At this time, Raven was sitting in his tent, trying to understand what could have happened to the local goblins to make them all disappear. He did not see how a figure in a dark cloak was standing on top of one of the rocks, from which dark energy was coming. Next to him, the hands of the dead were sticking out of the ground, trying to climb out. The same picture took place next to the camp, where the residents slept peacefully. In a moment, there was already a whole army of skeletons of missing goblins and a two-headed Cerberus near the camp. Hearing a commotion outside, Raven jumped in alarm. Jumping out there, he saw a dog with two huge heads whose eyes glowed with red demonic light. The boy watched in horror as saliva dripped from the giant mouths. Without thinking long, he jumped on the spot, trying to jump onto the monster's back. Looking at the attackers, the boy wondered where they could have come from. However, he was not surprised now that all the goblins had disappeared without a trace. Orienting himself, Raven swung his sword, attacking the giant Cerberus. In pain, the dog opened one of its mouths wide and howled loudly. Her howl made all the soldiers in the camp open their eyes, desperately trying to understand what was happening around them. The harpy also woke up, her eyes wide open in fright, while the Khazul was still sleeping peacefully under her wing. The orcs, who were waiting under the tree, also woke up, trying to catch something. Sir Killian woke up, and from fear his eyes began to resemble saucers. Hastily assembled, everyone jumped out of their tents, weapons tightly in their hands and trying to understand what was happening. The commander already wanted to inquire about the situation, but the words got stuck in his throat. The man saw how the young gentleman, standing on the jaws of a huge two-headed dog, was swinging a sword at one of them. Raven's eyes widened in fright when he heard Sir Killian's voice. In the next moment, his sword went right into one of the huge canine's eyes, but she shook her head in pain, throwing the attacker off her and trying to throw out what was obstructing her eye as well. The creature roared loudly at the Duke as he drew his other sword and swung it. However, when he was about to finish off the monster, Sir Killian and Karth ran up to him. Coming closer, the commander inquired about their situation. However, noticing the skeletons on the spine of Cerberus, he became more interested in whether these were the missing goblins. However, Karth himself was more interested in the question of who killed them all, to which Pendragon already knew the answer. In their world, only the Lich, a skeleton-like creature, could raise the dead, so he probably killed them all. Raven assumed that he just wanted to prevent them from getting to the mausoleum. Hearing this, the orc glared at the Duke with huge eyes. However, there was no time for conversation, as it was obvious to everyone that they were surrounded by skeletons and animated monsters. Looking at the faces of the various monsters, Pendragon added that they would not disappear until they managed to kill the necromancer himself. After assessing the situation, he ordered the squad members to bide their time until he himself found the mage and finished him off. Raising his sword aloft, Raven commanded his squad to advance, and they all charged forward at the enemies. Orcs swung their clubs, scattering small skeletons to the left and right. Sir Killian thought, as he swung his sword, that he couldn't let anyone stand in the way of restoring the greatness of House Pendragon. Remembering how the young man was before, the man understood that he had changed a lot, so he had every chance to achieve what his predecessors could not. And now he was looking at the Duke with eyes full of admiration. Sir Killian knew very well that all you have to do is give the boy a chance, and he will show all his strength and power, and of course, in the company of a dragon. Seeing a huge hound approaching him, the commander drew his sword forward, thinking that the days of their family's decline were in the past. After a moment's thought, he leaped forward, swinging his sword and delivering a single blow to the giant attacker. In a moment, the dog's head flew away from the body, hitting the rock wall and shattering it into pieces. The goblin skeletons stopped, throwing their spears at their chosen targets. The chosen target turned out to be Raven, who was fighting off the attack of two giant snakes. Looking around, the boy thought that the attack was aimed at him, so he did not have time to search for the necromancer. Catching the sword more conveniently, he jumped up, throwing himself at the snake in front of him. In a moment, she was already lying on the ground, and a sword was sticking out of her eye. Looking up, Raven thought that the foundation of the Volta family and the decline of the Pendragon family were definitely somehow connected. Looking at the second giant snake, the Duke drew his sword forward, preparing for another battle. He thought that despite all the obstacles, he would restore the good name of the Vault family. Seeing her open her mouth to swallow him, he swung his sword, cutting her in half. Looking at the battlefield, Raven thought with pride that they had managed to neutralize most of the attackers. However, he perfectly understood that the skeletons would be able to overwhelm them with their numbers, and besides, it was necessary to deal with the Lich himself. Suddenly the boy looked forward, seeing a huge blade that appeared from behind him. The Lich was a sorcerer who sealed away his soul in order to become immortal, and accordingly his appearance was specific. The Ned Empire did not like such necromancers, so it sent squads of demon destroyers to fight them. Raven remembered how he had once been sent with a squad to fight a single Lich, under which he saw that the head of one of the soldiers was simply torn apart. Looking around, the boy saw that the necromancer had managed to kill almost everyone in an instant. In a panic, he began to look around to know his enemy. He was sitting on the altar, surrounded by dark magic and purple mist. The demon slayers were stared at by empty eye sockets and a smile made up of sharp, large fangs. Raven's partner, seeing the Lich, ran away screaming that he wanted to live. However, he only moved a finger, and in a moment the boy was hanging on his blade, still squeezing out words about wanting to live. In the next second, his head exploded into small pieces. Raven looked at it all, thinking that it was all legends too, but now he saw that it was all real. He knew that the Lynch had many servants, but the most powerful of them, the ghosts, were invisible. The boy took a fighting stance, thinking that to ordinary people, a necromancer was just a spirit torn from the body. Hearing a sound behind him, he turned his head there. In the next moment, Raven barely managed to dodge the scythe flying in his direction, and now, looking at her blade, the boy remembered that if the scythe got hold of him, he would definitely be finished. Without thinking long, the Duke raised his sword and swung it, trying to fend off the necromancer's attack. Following this, a loud noise was heard from behind and a cloud of dust rose. A huge mouth with sharp fangs appeared from a pile of dust and stones. Raven knelt down, keeping her eyes on the creature that appeared. He stared at her unblinkingly, trying to understand what was happening. The boy remembered how he raised the sword, and the stone on its hilt lit up with a blue glow. Raven was so frozen in place that he didn't even notice the brutal battle going on behind him.